Author of life, we thank you for your word, and we ask that your Spirit would be with us this morning to transform us in heart and mind and soul. Amen. As I said last week, we're taking this time in Lent to get a sense of the whole sweeping narrative that leads from the beginning of the story of God's people all the way through to Jesus, so that we can have a better understanding of how Jesus is the promised Christ, the Messiah. We've got a lot of ground to cover between now and Palm Sunday, so it may seem just a little bit odd that we've only jumped ahead 10 chapters in the same book from last week. But these foundational agreements between God and his elect, which is just the fancy church way of saying the people that he tasked with the responsibility of helping him carry out his vision, these foundational agreements between God and his elect are the linchpin of understanding for the rest of the story. So in order to get us to today's reading, we need to backtrack a little bit and see what we missed, since the people that we know as Adam and Eve were forced to leave their garden and go out into the big, wide world. Generations passed, and people continued to rebel against the kind of life that God had intended for us, until it got to the point that God was so disappointed with the state of affairs that a decision was made to wipe the slate clean and try again. We all know the story that I'm talking about. It is, of course, the story of Noah and the great flood. God told Noah to build a boat and take one mating pair of all the creatures in the world and then reset everything by violently destroying it. And after 40 days of rising water, 40 days which foreshadows Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness and our 40 days in Lent, God finally relents. And then after another 204 days, Noah and the other survivors emerge from the ark. And the first thing that Noah does is construct an altar. And at this point, God makes the first covenant, not just with humanity, but with all of creation. God promises to never again curse the entire earth because of the evil in human hearts. God is getting used to having his heart broken by his children, and so God makes a promise not to lash out with this kind of violence again. Then more generations pass, and the humans are starting to make something of themselves. They've made so much of themselves, in fact, that they decide once again to try and put themselves on God's level. At a place that would come to be known as Babel in the land of Shinar, they start building a city that will reach into the heavens. To mix cultures a little bit, we could say that they are making a man-made Olympus, where they will dwell in the heights of their own arrogance. So God comes down and sees what his children are up to, and once again he sees the rebellion in their hearts, but he's made a promise, and so this time he doesn't destroy them. He just breaks up their little self-divination party and scatters them across the earth. God has once again tried to reboot the relationship with humanity in order to get us back on the right path. And then more generations go by, and people continue to be people, and finally we get to Abram and God's next attempt at making the relationship work. Abram was living in the city of Ur in the land of the Chaldeans when God shows up and says, "Hey, I need you to pack up your belongings, move out of this place, leave your ancestors behind, and follow me in the way that I want you to live." God's new plan is to take Abram and Abram's family and make them the model by which everyone else will see the truth of righteous living. God has tried the hands-off approach, and it isn't working out. So now God says, all right, let me take you by the hand and show you exactly what I expect. And that raises the important thing for us to know about the covenant relationship that exists between us and God. A covenant isn't just a mere legal contract. A contract spells out legal duties that one party will perform in relation to another and what the punishment will be if those duties aren't fulfilled. That is to say, a contract is focused on the duty or the service that is to be performed. A covenant has an entirely different basis. The foundational basis of the covenant is the relationship itself. And then out of that relationship stem the mutual obligations that will form the expectations of how we behave toward one another. Let me give you a simple example of a covenant so that we see how this works before we delve into the details of God's covenant with Abram. When I was in college, the dorm room that I lived in had 4 people to a room, and so one of the things that the RAs would do at the beginning of every year was pass out roommate agreements, and they would encourage us to actually take the time to fill them out, not just toss them in the trash. And I was blessed to have good roommates all 4 years that I lived in a dorm, but it did still help us to take the time to talk at the beginning of the year about our mutual expectations for things like personal hygiene, the ways that we would know what things in the common room of the dorm were to be shared and what things weren't, when and how it was okay to be loud and make noise compared to when and how we expected times of quiet. None of these things were something that we owed to one another out of a strict legal duty, but they were the things that helped us remain friends the entire time that we lived with each other and beyond. So keep in mind that covenants include expectations of one another, not because they're something that we are required to owe one another, but because the relationship is of paramount value. A covenant asks us to sacrifice part of ourselves, something that we don't have to sacrifice for the betterment of each other. There are actually 2 accounts of the covenant between Abram and God. The one that we read this morning and a similar but different account 2 chapters earlier in chapter 15. But the substance of both accounts is largely the same. God is entering into a covenant relationship with Abram, and both sides of the relationship have promises that they make to the other as a part of that relationship. God promises that he will make Abram, a man without a descendant by his wife, not only the father of Isaac, but the father of nations. He promises that he will remain faithful to Isaac's line for all of time, and he'll also bless Ishmael, who is Abram's firstborn bastard son. He'll give them a land to live in. And finally, that Abram and his descendants will be considered blameless as long as they walk in the ways of God. Which turns toward the expectations for Abram and his descendants. First, you have to actually follow the expectations of just and merciful living that God has established. Second, Abram needs to change his name, which means exalted ancestor, into Abraham, which means ancestor of a multitude, in order to reflect the blessing that God has promised. Third, and this is why our reading stopped where it did today, because if we went one more verse, the third expectation of the covenant is that all men who are part of the covenant need to be circumcised. And if you've been joining us for our Bible study on Acts, you've been seeing just how complicated some of these covenant promises get once a new covenant is established that expands God's promises to the rest of the nations. And then fourth, there's a part of the covenant that's not named here in chapter 17, but was a part of that initial call on Abram that we heard from chapter 12. In that first call, God says, "I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing." All of the things that God promises to Abraham here are not simply for the sake of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all of their descendants. God is making a relationship with this family for the sake of all families in the world. Abraham has been elected, has been called out and chosen so that he and his might be an example to all the world. Abraham is agreeing that he will sacrifice the identity that he has as Abram, that he and his descendants will sacrifice some of their freedoms, that they will indeed sacrifice some of their own flesh, and that they will ultimately sacrifice some of the gifts that they are given in exchange for the promise of loyalty and mercy from God. But God has made sacrifices in covenant too. At the time of the covenant with Noah, God sacrificed the right to destroy what God has created. God placed a limit on their own power so that all creation might be reminded that God truly loves us. And now here with Abraham, God is sacrificing some freedom too. God is making a promise that for all of time, from this moment forward, God will remain steadfast in loyalty to the people of Abraham. It doesn't matter how bad these particular people mess up, and if you've read the Bible, you know this, and if you haven't read the Bible, then trust me, they will mess up. They will mess up early, and they will mess up often. But no matter what, God has promised that none of those offenses will ever outweigh the relationship. And that is where we will leave off our story for today. Our God is a being who values the relationship with us more than any chance to punish us for our failures to uphold our end of the bargain. Are we going to fall short sometimes? Sure, of course we are. My roommates and I didn't always live up to our agreements with each other either. There was once or twice I had to bust out the dad voice and tell them to quiet down because I was trying to sleep. But at the end of the day, the shortcomings don't get the final say. No, at the end of the day, what matters is love. So as you continue on your Lenten journey, know that we sacrifice as a sign of the love that exists between us and God. Don't walk through this season with a sense of shame or guilt. Walk through this season knowing that we are blessed to have a God who wants to take the time to reconcile with us, who never stops trying to find ways to renew our relationship, who will sacrifice something of himself so that we know how loved we are. Amen. Please pray with me. Holy God, you have made promises to us throughout the ages in order to lure us back into the relationship with you that we seem all too eager to rebel against. We know that you have never failed to hold up your end of the agreement. We know that when we have walked or run away, you have been there waiting with open arms for the time when we were ready to return. Hold us firmly in the embrace of your love so that we might never forget the feeling of your merciful presence. Amen.